Hi there. Hawk Robinson with the nonprofit 501c3 RPG Research and the for-profit RPG Therapeutics LLC. I'm founder and president of each. Today's topic is on the pros and cons of each role-playing game format. There are 4 formats: solo adventure books and modules, like Choose Your Own Adventure, Lone Wolf, etc. Tabletop role-playing gaming, or just role-playing games, the original format. Computer-based role-playing games, and live-action role-playing. Just so you understand the abbreviations, solo adventure books and modules are abbreviated as SABM. If they're just solo adventure books, it'd just be SAB. If they're just solo adventure modules, they'd be SAM. Normal tabletop role-playing gaming can be referred to as just RPG or tabletop RPG or TRPG. You'll see variations on that. Computer-based RPGs, CRPG. And live-action role-playing as LARP, L-A-R-P. So the pros of the solo adventure books and modules, SABMs, they're accessible to a wide population. They're flexible in the time commitment. You can pick them up and set them down as you need to. You don't have to set a blocked amount of time to do the activities. They're well structured, which for some populations is very helpful. They're reusable. Many of them have many different endings, and so you can go back and make different choices and see what the different results are. They're generally inexpensive, a few dollars even for the new ones, and the old ones can be less than $1. Excuse me. And they have an easy training curve, so if you're using them in your facility, it's pretty easy to tell somebody how to play. They just walk you through. It doesn't have a steep learning curve. Some of the cons compared to other formats: they're generally not social. Now, this can be modified, as some game masters have done, and also educators and therapists and such, so that they can be read aloud and let the other individual or group help make decisions on what choice to make and make it an interactive experience rather than just a solo experience. But that's not their primary design. They're rigidly structured, which doesn't allow flexibility outside of their strict if-then design. It usually does not allow for character development. Now, this is mostly true of the solo adventure books. Some of the solo adventure modules let you have some actual character sheets and dice and some advancement, but it's mostly at a mechanical level. There isn't much in the way of social development and such. Though there are some out there that are specifically designed for social advancement and making the right social choices. It requires matching language ability. So whether it's being read aloud or you're trying to read it yourself, you need to be able to understand the language that they're written in. Fortunately, they are translated into a number of languages depending upon the product. But a lot of them are not. Many of them are just in English or whatever language they were written in. And if you're by yourself, it requires reading skills. So a 3-year-old is not going to be able to engage in it unless there's someone to read and guide them through it. So role-playing games in general, tabletop role-playing games, TRPG, they're pros. They're very social. They're inherently a social activity. Forget all the stereotypes we've talked about in all other research pieces about. No, it's an inherently social activity. It's cooperative gameplay generally. There are people who modify them to be competitive, but that's not the default for tabletop RPG, rather than the competitiveness of computer-based role-playing games and many LARPs. Tabletop RPGs are accessible to a wide range of populations, young and old, disabilities, different levels of intellectual functioning, many different cultures. They've been translated into many languages throughout the world. Generally, they're inexpensive, especially compared to computer-based role-playing games, and depending on the LARP, fairly inexpensive. It's not that you can't spend a small fortune on them, but as far as the necessity of what you need to engage in the activity, the minimum amount can be, some of the stuff's free, but very inexpensive, and you don't have ongoing recurring costs, subscriptions, things like that generally. So even on the more expensive side, if you wanted to get started with Dungeons & Dragons, the current 5th edition, you need a player's handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. Yes, there's other add-ons, but that's what you need to be able to play an unlimited amount. And that's going to run you in the neighborhood of $150 to $200 tops. You could probably get some better deals and find someone closer to $100. So that's a little bit of a chunk of change up front, but then it's reusable infinitely. Excuse me. I have books here from the 1970s, the original D&D. We were running through that a few years ago, a late night game session at a local store, the original Dungeons and Dragons. And the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, we're currently running groups still to this day. So again, very affordable, especially in the reusability aspect, and even up front. It's not too bad. You can get the starter kit for 5th edition, little basic kit for $20. It encourages creativity. It's the core nature of the activity, is to have a creative approach to problem solving and just using your imagination. Unlimited flexibility of options. You don't have a rigid if-then. You're only limited by your imagination and your game master's imagination. The possibilities are pretty much infinite, unlike computer-based and solo adventure books and modules. It's generally easy to find players and groups in small cities or larger. Still a little tricky to find game masters that are available. There always seems to be a shortage of those, but finding players is pretty easy, and joining a group is not too difficult, again, in small cities on up. We'll talk about where it can be more of a challenge in the cons. It's generally easy to find locations to play. All you need is a table and chairs or a couch and a floor. I mean, your options are flexible. You can meet at a park. You can meet at a game store. You can meet at your house. Lots of flexibility there. It doesn't have to be a big public venue. You don't have to book space, unless you're doing something larger. It's easy to find locations. There's very little equipment needed. Typically, you just need paper, pencil, and dice, and whatever rule books you're using. You don't have to have a lot of equipment like you do for LARP. You don't have to have the latest game console or PC upgrades as you do for computer-based. So pretty straightforward. Being involved in role-playing games, and this is kind of true for all of them, but especially tabletop and live-action versions, can encourage many other interests in history, literature, cartography, painting, sculpting, metallurgy, physics, geology, geography. The list goes on and on and on and on. All kinds of things. I've seen people launch careers because of what they got excited about in a role-playing game. And then ancillary activities. So we have the interests, and then we have the activities like miniature painting, terrain building, writing the modules. All these other things can be triggered by the activity as well. So that's definitely a positive. Now, some of the cons compared to other formats, tabletop RPGs are not physically active generally. There's no current research on obesity rates for tabletop role-playing gaming, though there's quite a bit on computer-based role-playing gaming. And I don't know if there's been any done on the LARP side. I hope Professor Bowman or some of the others doing the LARP research could let me know if anybody's done any research. It would probably depend on the LARP. The more active, maybe boffer type or more physically out there LARPs probably have lower obesity rates, and the ones that are more sedentary probably have higher rates. So since tabletop role-playing game is inherently a sit-around-the-table activity, and there's a tradition of munchies and all of that, and you're sitting for a prolonged period of time, 3-4+ hours, it's the stereotype of the rounded role-playing gamer, might have some merit, but it's going to depend on a lot of variables. But whether or not that's the same as, different than computer-based role-playing game obesity rates, don't know. It would be some interesting research to do. It can be difficult to find players, groups, and especially game masters in smaller towns. So you start getting into rural areas, you might be the only role-playing gamer there, and you might have trouble recruiting somebody else to play with you. You might have to become the GM even though you've never done it. That's where the RPG trailer and RPG bus try to help, is we do a circuit all around the Northwest and hopefully eventually all of the North America, providing services in rural and remote locations. But that can be a challenge. Now, with the advent of internet technologies advancing, if you can get a little broadband to your house, you can do things over video. They have lots of web-based tools to help address that. But it's not quite the same experience as being there in person around the table. And I've done some research on that, on the immersion and flow state experiences. And the moment you involve a screen, the amount of immersion and experiences of flow state decreases compared to an in-person experience. So that can be more of a problem in the smaller towns. It does require social communication and cooperative problem-solving skills in order to play successfully. You do have people who are dysfunctional in those areas, and if they're in a supportive group that will help nurture them and help them develop those skills, great. But you can end up in games with people who either are resistant to development or the group is not patient enough to help them develop, whatever the reasons. And so people who don't have those skills, at least at a modicum level that are tolerable, might get excluded from the activity. There is ongoing societal stigma about tabletop role-playing gamers, and even outright hostility in some locations, especially more rural locations. You have pastors and others who, to this day, are going around talking about the evils of role-playing games, and outright bans, book burnings, all of that are still an active thing, though not anywhere near the peak of frenzy that it was in the 80s. Talked about that in detail in other videos and papers. You can check those out at rpgresearch.com if you want. Without a strongly skilled game master or a therapeutic recreation specialist supervision, because I do a lot of stuff with the TR, if participants are lacking in those social skills, the activity can break down and lead to group dissolution. So it really does require certain dynamics and aren't necessarily in the computer-based or the solo adventure ones. You do kind of have the same issues with live action. And so you need to have a group that can function well enough. There is a steep learning curve to become a GM. If you have no prior tabletop role-playing game experience, it'll take you weeks to months of training. I mean, you can go through the walkthrough, you can go through the basic stuff and start doing it and put your first group together with friends. And if it's with friends, then maybe it'll go fine. You can do it quickly. But you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. A lot of stuff happens, and so there's a long learning curve. Now, there is professional training now available. There's online courses available at rpgedu.com. There's professional certification programs being made available through rpgtherapeutics.com and other places. And you can, of course, check out online videos. There's all sorts of resources if you take the time. And rpgresearch.com shares all the research information. There's a whole section on optimizing the role-playing game experience, and you can use all those resources to help speed up the learning curve. But it takes a long time to get good at game mastering. Becoming a player is pretty quick and easy, but getting a GM takes a while. So that's a con in that it's a long learning curve. So computer-based role-playing games, CRPGs, the pros, they're readily available in many styles, formats, and genres and titles, as are all of these. All RPG formats are available in all of these styles, formats, genres, and titles. Computer-based role-playing games are now very popular and much more culturally accepted than tabletop and LARP. So there's a lot less stigma. In fact, a lot of video game stuff now is cool. And that wasn't always the case a few decades ago. Excuse me. Even maybe 20 years ago or so, there was still a fair amount of stigma about computer games. And you still hear, with the shootings and everything else, still a lot of that same stuff going on, blaming video games, etc. And so there's still that going on. But in general, computer gaming has become accepted as long as you don't get too over the top. You know, there are WoW players who play 16 hours a day, and that's not healthy, period. And there's stigma about that. Computer role-playing games are much more flexible than SABMs, the solo adventure books and modules, though they are generally still kind of if-then. I mean, some of them are using object-oriented programming and design and have more flexible matrices and such, but they still are limited generally to what the programmers make. Even in these sandbox-type computer-based games, there's a lot of limitations compared to live action and tabletop role-playing. But many of them are much more flexible than any SABM will be. So it's a kind of middle of the road there. And for those who need a little more structure, that can be a good thing. Online versions of the game, because some of them are offline, although that's becoming less and less common, you can join with existing friends or family or even make new friends online. It's easy to find others to game with online. They provide the services and tools to do that pretty easily. Research does support that about 1 hour per day is beneficial to key brain development. And actually, that's pretty much video games across the board. Role-playing games, you might actually be able to push that a little more because because of the complexity of them compared to others. Now, we're talking more pure role-playing rather than like Tetris or shooters. When it's more socially complex and such, then you can get more benefit out of it compared to the shooters and more simplistic games. But across the board, multiple studies now show about an hour a day, lots of benefits to key brain development. And I've got whole other videos and papers on that topic if you want to delve into that, rpgresearch.com. There are many adaptive interfaces available for people with various disabilities. You have oversized controllers, voice control, whole body Wii adapters, weights. I've got pictures of people in wheelchairs where they're just moving their body like this and they're on kind of a teeter-totter. Lots and lots of adaptive options for computer-based interfaces, which can be very handy. Even for people who can't move at all, if they can speak, there's voice to text for some of them. Others, there's eye movement. There's just lots and lots of options out there. And now with the EEG, electroencephalogram, and other brain interface, neural interface tools that have been developing out of Australia and elsewhere, you literally can think your way through like some of the VR settings. They're still kind of primitive, but they're coming along nicely. And so for people who are profoundly disabled, it gives them a whole new life to experience again. It's wonderful what's available there. So these interfaces can help those who are bedridden and also those who have just computer games in general, the role-playing games, can help those with social phobias to connect with the world when they otherwise normally be socially isolated behind the safety of a screen or keyboard or console. Now, there's cons to that too. We'll get into that. We've used that as programs to help people advance from social isolation step by step to more and more socially engaged and been able to break out of their phobias quite successfully. It's really remarkable to watch. Computer role-playing games, at least initially, have a fairly low training curve, though you need to know which are better games and what equipment you need to have, etc. And they can become increasingly complex over time to a frustrating level for some people. And so if you have certain disabilities, you want to make sure you choose turn-based role-playing games over real-time role-playing games. Turn-based ones will sit there and wait for your input. So if you have a slower interaction, either because of a physical disability, cognitive disability, what have you, use the turn-based role-playing games that will wait for that input. Don't use the real-time ones because that will become very frustrating and you don't want to make it so they can't play. Now, some of the well-known cons for computer-based role-playing games. Generally not physically active, although exceptions with the Wii and others, but those are in the minority, unfortunately. And research does show, multiple research studies show higher levels of obesity in computer-based role-playing gamers compared to the general public. Now, as I stated before, I don't know of any research on obesity levels for any of the other formats. SABMs, I don't know they're relevant because I don't know anybody does them enough for that to show up to be statistically significant. But Tabletop and LARP would be interesting to get that added into the mix. Maybe someday we can get the funding for that. If you ever want to support our funding, go to patreon.com/RPG Research and you can support us doing that. We have over 200 research questions we want to answer. The offline versions of the computer role-playing games are not social. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are things like That Dragon Cancer and, what's the teenage one? A Strange World or something like that, where it's all about making social decisions and reading social cues and such. But those are in the there's only a handful of those. Most of them are pretty hack and slashy and do not really encourage social skill development, although you see some of that changing. But especially compared to the online version of the computer role-playing games, definitely not social, and definitely not social compared to Tabletop and LARP. The online versions can have a pretty rough online community with very poor social experiences. I mean, without even getting into like Gamergate and such, it can be pretty rough community out there. Now, there are some that are more protective, that are better suited for children and are nicer communities and enforce that, but those are also in the minority. The computer-based role-playing game format is much more controlling in structure than tabletop and LARP. A lot less freedom, and generally doesn't help with the creativity and such because of those restrictions. Although it's not as restrictive as a SABM by any means. They typically do not encourage strong communication skills. That just doesn't seem to be a key part. Now, there are educational games out there. That's a different story. But as far as the general recreational ones, that's not usually the case. They usually gear it for pretty low level of communication skills, which has, some accessibility advantages. Companies intentionally build in too much grinding and hooking to make money rather than real enjoyment of the game. They've used psychology on how to get those dopamine hits and such, and get those reward centers going, and so it keeps them engaged enough. It keeps the stimulus going, but they're not really getting a holistic, pleasurable experience. It's a very narrow one, but it keeps them going, and that can lead to these people coming up with addictive-like behavior patterns, as the World Health Organization for the ICD-11, I think it's 11, has now put out their tentatively video game addiction to be researched for. That doesn't mean it's a diagnosis yet, but they're looking into it. And it's like any other behavior where you keep doing incremental, sporadic rewards. They're using it intentionally rather than trying to go for a larger reward that's more complicated and a little less surface. So that I find most of those games like World of Warcraft and the others absolutely boring because I can see that so obviously. It doesn't give me the reward that it does others, and it's nothing like the experience of a LARP or tabletop, and I just find them downright boring. But your mileage varies. The computer-based role-playing games can be expensive, with upfront costs for the games alone of $60+ monthly, $5, $10, $15, $25 a month or more. Not to mention gaming hardware upgrade and the consoles. The consoles can be hundreds and hundreds of dollars, or the PCs that you have to keep upgrading. So that can get expensive, and it keeps recurring costs. You keep having to pay more. If you don't, the service goes away, or you lose access, or you have to get to the next version because they phased it out. And then finally, online anonymity, and this is related to the rough online communities, often leads to incendiary and aggressive behavior and mistreatment of others. This is all related to the research that shows that when somebody is anonymized, doesn't feel accountable, there's a lack of the humanity and the connection, empathy goes away. There's a lot of deficits that occur when you're hidden behind that keyboard in supposedly anonymous state. People can behave very badly because of that, very differently than they would. And especially when you start to get into group dynamics where the norms are okay to be that rough towards each other, people get into that groupthink mode and will do things they normally wouldn't do. So that's a real problem in these settings with the computer-based role-playing gaming. Excuse me. LARP, live action role-playing pros. Physically active, although that varies. The boffer ones are certainly very active. Some of the more adventure ones that go exploring can be pretty active. And then you have others where you barely move. You may just sit at tables and move from table to table, or make a meal, or there's all sorts of variants. So wide range of physical activity. But in general, LARPs are more physically active than the tabletop or the computer-based or the solo adventure books and modules. LARPs are generally accessible to a wide range of populations, though with some caveats. LARPs don't always take into account some accessibility issues, and often the people running LARPs don't know how to address that. If you are interested in doing so, we have a lot of information on rpgresearch.com about adaptations for different populations. Please do check that out so you can let all populations be able to engage in your activities. Teamwork is definitely a common theme in LARP, whether it's team against team, which is the most common, or just one group that's working as a team to solve a problem. It encourages creativity. There's a lot of suspension of disbelief, just like in tabletop RPG. And it often encourages problem-solving skills. The boffer LARPs, not so much, other than just how do I out-boffer this other guy. But so the more simplistic boffer LARPs, not so much, but all the other LARPs often have a problem-solving component. The learning curve for rules light LARPs is pretty easy. But then you get other LARPs that are very complicated, that can have hundreds of pages of rules that can take a long time to get the hang of. But they generally have a process of working through. That being said, the rules knowledge isn't always consistent. And so it's good if you can get your hands on an actual copy of the rules, because sometimes a ruling might be somebody's misremembrance. Some of the cons. Most of them, not all, are often, at least in the U.S., are often more competitive than cooperative, especially the buffer LARPs, which are the most popular ones in the U.S., at least the most visible ones anyway. In other countries, there's more of a mixture, and it's growing here in the U.S. to have the non-buffer LARPs, but they're hard to find. Even here in Spokane, which is a mid-sized city, it's very difficult to find a non-buffer LARP. I've had to host some myself just so that they exist here. The combat-centered LARPs are more athletics focused, and so that can exclude many other player types. So if people have coordination issues, if they're on the spectrum, and they can often have some of those coordination issues, or they have disabilities, it requires them to have actual, it's dependent on their own abilities rather than an abstract character. So in tabletop, you have an abstracted character, and I forgot to put this in the pros, I need to put that in this presentation. In tabletop role-playing gaming, you are able to do things far beyond your own, your character can do things far beyond your own limitations. In combat buffer LARPs, it's much more about what you can do personally rather than your character. You may or may not get a few modifiers, pluses and minuses, but it's mostly based on what you're physically capable of. And again, that's the more combat-centric ones. You get into the other more role-play type, and then that becomes less of an issue. It can be somewhat expensive for equipment, costumes, facilities. That can all add up. Generally less expensive than computer-based RPGs, but not always. It depends upon how far you go with it. But you do have a flexibility of range, fortunately. The biggest challenge is it's hard to find groups in your area, especially if you want non-buffer. But even with buffer, I mean, we're a mid-sized city here, small size city here, and the county has about 500,000 people. The city has about 3/4 of that, and there's Amped Guard is the main buffer LARP, and then there's an occasional Firefly, occasional Vampire rises up, but really very few options from the LARP perspective. Again, I've tried to host different ones to address that. You get into areas like Seattle and such, you have far more choices, but you get to smaller than here, there's nothing. And, you can try to form it yourself, but the next point, location accommodations can be challenging and or limited by weather outdoors. So a lot of times groups will meet outdoors at a park. That's easy enough. They may or may not have to pay for that. They may be able to just reserve it, or, it depends. But then when winter comes around, if they're in an area that's an issue, up north, that's definitely an issue here where we are. Get down south, you might be able to do it more year-round. But that can be an issue. And then you got to find accommodations that can handle a large group indoors, a gym or something like that. That's not always easy to do. And the final point, because of ongoing social stigma, a lot of places won't let you bring your activities into their facilities. There's not only misunderstandings and stigma about LARP, there's downright hostility in many locations, more than arguably any other form of RPG, because it's the most visible. It's people often in costumes, not always, but the ones that are. And I mean, you see it in movies over and over where paintballers go attack the LARPers, things like that. Well, that's kind of based on real-world experiences, and people drive by honking their horn, throwing insults. That's a common experience for a LARPer, and so that's unfortunate, but it's a reality that's still an issue, at least here in the States, and I've heard of it in some other countries. But hopefully, over time, that will keep changing as it has for computer-based and a little bit for tabletop. So that kind of gives you a high-level overview of the pros and cons. Overall research on role-playing games, there's lots of correlative research disproving a lot of the negative stereotypes and a lot of possible positive indicators, but there are too few causal studies of sufficient size and controls, although we're starting to see some growth in that, and we're trying to do a lot of those ourselves. There's too many people working in private silos. Either they don't know about others, or RPG research where we're trying to get everybody to share all their data, or they're afraid to share publicly their secret sauce because they feel some sort of competitive nature. And so that isolation is hurting the adoption and acceptance of role-playing games. And also, you keep reinventing the wheel again and again. I've run into people, and I've been doing this gaming since the 70s, teaching it in a school program since the early to mid 80s, doing it from a therapeutic perspective since 2004. And I run into people all the time that are reinventing the wheel, reinventing the wheel, reinventing the wheel. And I founded RPGresearch.com trying to get people to stop doing that and learn from the mistakes that have already been made out there so we can make a lot more progress. So please share your findings and experiences. Get them on RPGresearch.com, or at least link to it from there so that people can find it, so we can actually grow this knowledge domain much more effectively. Don't hoard the data and experiences. Share it out there, and it'll float all boats. We'll start reducing the stigma more, and you'll have a larger pool of game masters and more players, and it'll be more accessible to even more people. The incredible benefits that have been found from engagement in any of these formats to varying degrees. Just want to put that out there. And if you want to support our efforts, RPG Research is a nonprofit 501c3 charitable organization, and so your donations can now be a tax benefit if you itemize your taxes. You can support us on patreon.com/RPG Research, and all of our research that we're allowed. We have a lot of research we can't share publicly because we're waiting for permission or they haven't granted us permission. But we have it in our database. So often if you ask a specific research question on our Discord channel or through email, we have the resources to answer. You go, hey, go see this paper. This is what you want to get. But everything we're allowed to make public, we put out there as publicly as possible, and our own research included. So I hope you found this useful. I look forward to your comments. And wherever you be well and happy gaming.